There are new varieties of apple being developed all the time. I'm Ruth Alexander and I'm finding out how you do it, why you do it, and how much thought goes into that first bite.
The Food Chain, today at 11:30 and 23:30 GMT. At bbcworldservice.com. BBC Trending.
Serbia's ruling SNS party is rumoured to command the online activity of a small army of citizens. But what's the truth behind those claims?
Next, it's Unexpected Elements. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news, the show that brings you the science behind the news. This week, we turn our attention to the latest crop of leaders. Am I just getting older, or is the new French Prime Minister very young? As leading a country supposedly takes years off your life expectancy, is it any wonder that the stress of it also makes your hair go grey? But now scientists know why. Maybe we should take some lessons from an animal that doesn't seem to age. Cynics might say that the naked mole rat looks old and wrinkled to begin with, but we'll be hearing how it might be down to the secrets of its body clock. Assuming that we can't get a genetic dose of whatever those long-lived rodents have, we look at a couple of different ways to keep young. Chilean writer Isabel Allende recommends falling in love in your 70s. More prosaically, diet experts suggest eating your greens. Plus, where did all of Earth's water come from, and multilingual puns. That's all coming up after this.
I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. Hello. Pakistan has carried out strikes on what it called terrorist hideouts across the border in Iran, 2 days after Iranian attacks on Pakistani soil. The Foreign Ministry said a number of people were killed in Sistan-Baluchistan province. Earlier this week, Iran used similar language, saying it had targeted a militant group in the Pakistani part of Baluchistan. Mumtaz Zahra Baluch is a spokeswoman for Pakistan's government.
This morning's action was taken in light of credible intelligence of impending large-scale terrorist activities against Pakistan by these terrorists. This action is a manifestation of Pakistan's unflinching resolve to protect and defend its national security against all threats.
The United States has carried out another round of airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. The US military said it targeted 14 missiles which were ready to be launched. The operation came shortly after an American-owned commercial vessel was hit by a drone on Wednesday. The US and Britain first attacked Houthi sites a week ago. From Washington, here's Will Vernon.
The US and its allies said that they had two objectives. The first one was to dissuade the Houthis from carrying out further attacks on Red Sea shipping. The second one was to degrade their capabilities to do so. Now, it would appear that they're not really having much success in either of those. Attacks on shipping in the Red Sea continue, albeit on a smaller scale, and that begs the question, what is the way out of this? What is the exit strategy to ensure the US does not get embroiled in a regional war and ensure that the situation, this tit for tat, does not continue?
Singapore's transport minister has resigned over the city-state's biggest corruption scandal in decades. S. Iswaran stepped down after pleading not guilty to a series of charges in court, including obstructing the course of justice. He's accused of accepting tickets to events from one of Singapore's wealthiest property tycoons. The authorities in Ecuador have reacted to the killing of a leading prosecutor with a promise to keep up their campaign against criminal gangs. Cesar Suarez was investigating last week's attack by gunmen on a television studio in Guayaquil when he was shot dead in the city. Ecuador's Attorney General said the commitment to tackle organised crime had only been strengthened by the killing. Here's Ione Wells.
We have seen attack upon attack upon attack in the last couple of days. Remember that initial attack on the television station was in part prompted by the President Daniel Noboa announcing a state of emergency the day before, and that was in response to a spate of violent attacks that had taken place across the country. There is just such an array at the moment of violence that I think there is certainly a feeling that things have got out of control.
World News from the BBC. Colombian police have arrested a man suspected of involvement in the attempted assassination last year of one of the founders of Spain's far-right Vox party. Alejo Vidal Quadras survived being shot in the head in Madrid last November. Colombian police said the Venezuelan suspect helped to plan the attack. He was arrested crossing a bridge from Venezuela into Colombia. Security forces in Uganda have blockaded the homes of the country's two main opposition politicians ahead of a planned protest in the capital Kampala. Kizza Besigye and the former pop star Bobby Wine say soldiers and police officers are preventing them from leaving. They called the protest to demand repairs to the city's roads. Tens of thousands of public sector workers in Northern Ireland are on strike in what's being described by unions as the biggest walkout in a generation. Nurses, teachers and bus drivers are among those who've gone without a pay rise because the devolved government hasn't functioned since 2022. The British Minister for Northern Ireland said a funding package was available on condition that the Assembly resumed work. But David Thompson from the Unite Union accused the Minister of making the problem worse.
The Secretary of State is using these people and the whole public of Northern Ireland as pawns in a game. He can't do that. He's there to support the government, to help the people of Northern Ireland, to build an economy in Northern Ireland going forward, and what he's doing is putting it on cliff edge where it'll tip over and it'll destroy the entire public services in Northern Ireland.
Literary critics in Japan are divided over the announcement by an author who won a prestigious award that her book was partially written with the help of artificial intelligence. Rie Kudan said about 5% of her novel Sympathy Tower was generated by the chatbot ChatGPT. She said AI had helped to unlock her creativity. Judges of the Oktagawa Prize praised the novel as being universally enjoyable. BBC News.
Aren't you a bit too old to start getting rotting teeth? Teased my flatmate last week. I'd come back from a trip to the dentist a bit down in the mouth because I'd been told I was going to need my first filling, and it's a small point of pride that I've escaped them thus far. I was indignant. Too old for rotting teeth? That made no sense. Surely, the longer you're alive, the more chances bacteria have to eat through your tooth enamel. Annoyingly, though, he was right. I checked. Holes in teeth aren't an inevitable part of ageing. I know lots of kids who hate brushing their teeth twice a day, but maybe I, as a proper grown-up, should have been a bit more thorough. I'm Marnie Chesterton from the BBC World Service. This is Unexpected Elements. Enough of my dental woes and time to say hello to this week's Unexpected Elements panel. In Austin, Texas, in the US, it's Yang Cheng. Welcome back.
Hi, thank you so much for having me back.
And from Johannesburg in South Africa, it's Candice Bailey. Hello, welcome back.
Hey, Marnie, thanks for having me.
Candice, you have a small extra person.
I do.
Do you mind if I ask you about that? Because I heard that being pregnant is not great for your teeth. Were you told about that?
I was, and I learned that up to 70% of women who fall pregnant develop gingivitis during their pregnancy. So
that's gum disease.
By that. Yeah, gum disease.
Is it because your body needs to provide the extra calcium and vitamins to feed the baby?
Exactly. The baby basically takes everything from you. It's like a
little parasite.
I was trying to find a better word, Marnie, but yes, it's like a parasite.
Very beautiful.
Very beautiful parasite, yes.
So I should say Yang, Candice and I have been busily scrolling through the week's news, and what we do is we look for the science that lies behind the headlines, and then we kind of swerve into science land, and then we go from there. So let's hear a little clue as to the story that's starting us off this week.
France has a new Prime Minister. Gabriel Attal, who's 34, will be the youngest Prime Minister in French history.
He has energy, charm and fluency, qualities which you'll need in large amounts given the challenges that face him.
Ridiculous hours.
Tales of stress.
The emotional toll.
Lack of sleep. Huge impact on the aging process. I woke up one morning and the front of my hair had gone white.
This is a year when half the world will be voting in elections. An unprecedented 4 billion people will be electing their leaders. And over in France, Gabriel Attal has been enjoying his first week in the job as Prime Minister. the newspapers have been enjoying pointing out that he's only 34 and asking, is that too young? So, Unexpected Elements thought we'd have a look at leadership and age to see if science has anything to add here.
So, Moni, Yang, this reminds me of a story from a couple of years ago. Do you remember when President Barack Obama was in power? He started off with quite a youthful, dark patch of hair, and by the end of his second term, he was salt and pepper.
Yes, I remember it very well because I was living in Chicago at the time, and I remember all these media reports and different kinds of campaign chatter about the president going gray, whether he's still agile.
Talking of leaders going grey, there was a study that was titled How the Stress of Fight or Flight Turns Hair White. And this found a connection between noradrenaline and hair turning grey. Now, noradrenaline is a neurotransmitter molecule that's involved in the fight or flight response to stress. So they were testing it on mice, and they found that by blocking receptors that detected noradrenaline, they completely blocked stress-inducing aging. But when they activated the sympathetic nervous system, which drives our fight or flight response, the mice would turn grey.
I thought mice were grey anyway, but clearly they used mice that weren't grey to start with, because that would have been a terrible experiment.
I think it's a different grey.
Yeah. So there is a connection. It's interesting that it links to our fight or flight response, because if that evolved to protect ourselves, does that mean that we've evolved greying for some sort of evolutionary benefit?
Well, there's an argument that if we look at the adult male silverback mountain gorilla, which get their grey hair on their backs after they reach full maturity, they could have evolved to turn grey to show that they've endured enough stress to earn grey hair. And therefore, they have a higher place in the social order.
Okay, that makes sense for silverbacks and possibly for politicians as well, but not so sure about the mice. But I'll take it. I regularly stress about deadlines, and yet I don't seem to be going grey.
The question is, have you looked thoroughly?
Yeah, probably not.
Well, there's actually an answer for that, Moni, to be honest. Apparently, there's a threshold when you turn grey. Martin Pickett from Columbia University in the US ran a mathematical modeling on this, and he thinks that hair needs to reach a certain threshold before it turns grey. Stress will push it over the threshold, and then it transitions to grey. So then they found that the hair color can be restored when stress ends. How cool is that?
Well, given how many people dye their hair, that is potentially worth billions, I'd say. So if my hair does turn grey because of stress, it could turn back to brunette again.
That's the suggestion. So what they did is they analyzed hairs from 14 volunteers, and then they compared it to stress diaries that these participants had. And what they found is that immediately they noticed some grey hairs naturally regaining their original color, and that had never actually been documented. In one case, one of the volunteers went on holiday, and 5 grey hairs on that person's head had reverted back to dark during the break. So it's a sign we should be going on holiday more often.
That's what I'm taking from it.
Me too.
So if I go grey, it might not be forever.
Don't take it like that, Moni. Well, because of this threshold for greying, they don't think that reducing stress in, for example, a 70-year-old person who's been grey for years will darken their hair again, or increasing stress in a 10-year-old will be enough to tip the hair over the grey threshold.
Oh, that's a shame.
Or you can just resort to chemical assistance and dye your hair. This is what generations of Chinese leaders have been doing through the 90s and 2000s, where they would sport jet black hair. However, Xi Jinping broke with the president and sported salt and pepper hair in public. And this was seen as a way to show a more confident leadership style.
What about over in South Africa? Is there a trend for politicians to dye their hair, Candice?
Not really, but I must tell you, one of our most controversial politicians is former President Jacob Zuma, and he probably had a lot of stress. But we wouldn't have been able to see if he was dyeing his hair or if he was greying because he has just shaved his head bald. So
that's one way around
it. He saved us the trouble.
When I was in elementary school, my mom would shave my head bald every single summer. On one hand, she couldn't possibly care about doing my hair every morning, so it saved her time. On the other hand, she also felt that feminine traits is a distraction from studies. So if I had a completely bald head, then I couldn't possibly waste time on thinking about hairstyles.
Wow.
How do you feel about that, Yang?
I did not feel strongly about that, but actually I had neighbors who wondered whether my family had secretly broken China's one-child policy at the time and had a son because they thought I was a little boy running around when they knew they had a daughter.
I have to tell you, I would not look good with a bald head. So I'm glad that my mom did not shave my head bald.
Moving on, if anyone else is wondering how they've gotten so old and yet don't seem destined to run a country, I mean, I'm fine with that, but it sounds from this week's fact file like some of the Unexpected Elements team are taking this to heart.
Are you all right, Dan? You're looking a bit down.
I don't know, Alex. I've just heard the Prime Minister of France is only 34 and it's got me thinking.
Thinking about what?
Well, that's younger than me, and what have I achieved? I've never led a government. I haven't even led a book group.
Look, you've got plenty of time yet. Paul Biya's the president of Cameroon, and he's almost 91. Or there was Giovanni Paolo Lascaris, the oldest state leader of all time. He was Grand Master of the Knights of Malta until he died in 1657 when he was some 97 years old.
Well, I can't see anyone making me Grand Master of the Knights of Malta anytime soon. And 34's not even that young to be a world leader.
You don't think?
Alexander the Great was only 20 when he became King of Macedonia, and Tutankhamun was about 8 when he became Pharaoh of the Egyptian kingdom.
Well, they didn't really have much say in the matter, being hereditary. This is really getting to you a bit, isn't it?
There's a chance it might be.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, you're definitely the youngest person in this fact file.
Thanks, Alex, but how can I put it? Not really saying much.
Watch it, young man.
Thanks to the young and sprightly yet highly achieving team there of producers Alex and Dan. If, like me, you fritter too much of your life away on social media sites, you will have come across endless age-related lists. 30 things to do before you reach 30. It's weird when you look how life expectancy is going up, that there's also all of this pressure to have achieved so young. And I'm not talking 34-year-old French Prime Minister young, I mean child prodigies. Every country and culture seems to have them, but Yang, you're going to shed some light on China's distinct fascination with the child genius.
Yes, there are a lot of legends about child prodigies, but usually these emphasize literary talent. However, in contemporary China, the focus is more on science and math. The most well-known program in China associated with the idea of child prodigy is 少年班, or the Special Class for the Gifted Young, located at University of Science and Technology of China. So basically, each year, they would select a few dozen students from across China. You have to be at most 15 years or younger to start university. And that was where I studied in the late 2000s, and I majored in physics.
You were a child prodigy. Congratulations.
I was not. I genuinely was not.
And is there a selection process?
Intelligence is something that, of course, there are many studies or many ways to measure it. Actually, remember when I was in kindergarten, there was this so-called IQ test. And I remember that on one hand, I could not tie my shoelaces. On the other hand, I made up for the score on the memory section because they told us a story, asked us to retell it. And I told it perfectly because I had heard the story before. So this really tells a way of how different metrics are being socially constructed. And this is another interesting example of how science is inherently social and political.
Intelligence isn't just one thing, is it?
Exactly, right? If we live in a society that really values physical prowess, I would have failed very miserably, but I happen to be very good at certain types of standardized tests. I joke about that I went to this so-called child prodigy class, but I certainly do not claim that label.
Well, I can pin it on you.
As a child prodigy?
Yeah, joining us, former child prodigy, Yang.
Oh, former.
And any child prodigies amongst our listeners, do get in touch and tell us how it worked out for you. You can get in touch on unexpected@bbc.co.uk, or you can WhatsApp us on +44 330 678 3080, or write to us, Unexpected Elements, BBC World Service, Cardiff, UK, CF104GA. Still to come on the show, what can we learn about aging and bodily timekeeping from a small pink naked rat? After this.
Hello, it's Quizman Dan, back to test out your obscure scientific knowledge with our Unexpected Elements quiz question. This week, we want to look at a physics paper published back in 1975 into Atomic Behaviour. It was co-authored by Jack H. Hetherington and F.D.C. Willard and went on to be frequently cited. But what we want to know is what was unusual about F.D.C. Willard? A. He died more than 100 years previously. B. He was a cleaner who'd accidentally solved a problem on Jack Hetherington's blackboard. Or C. He was a cat. So was co-author F.D.C. Willard unusual because A. He died more than 100 years previously. B. He was a cleaner who'd accidentally solved a problem on a blackboard. Or C. He was a cat. Put your thinking cap on for that one and we'll be back with the answer a little later on.
You're listening to Unexpected Elements from the BBC World Service. We've been talking about ageing and leadership, and there's one animal with a lot to teach us about both, the naked mole rat. And here to share is Gisela Helfer, Senior Lecturer in Physiology and Metabolism at the Faculty of Life Sciences at the University of Bradford. Gisela, we've been talking about leaders, and I follow the Smithsonian Zoo in Washington, D.C. on social media, and they recently announced a case of regicide among their naked mole rat community. So their queen was murdered. Have you come across that? And can I just check that all naked mole rat groups have a queen?
Yes, it is true. So there is only one breeding female, and all the other females in the colony are basically in the reproductive state like children, like pre-puberty. And there are only about 2 to 3 breeding males. And again, the other males are all subordinates and reproductive suppressed. So it does happen occasionally that one queen is outruled by another, that another female goes spontaneously into puberty and then can attack the queen. There will always only be one female in the colony that can reproduce.
Wow, this is starting to sound a bit like Game of Thrones.
It is quite brutal, to be honest, and it has happened in our colonies that you come in the morning and you might find a new breeding female, and former breeding female had been murdered.
So that queen naked mole rat was 11, which is way older than I'd expect an average rat to live for. But these are no average rats.
No, and there are actually no rats either. So naked mole rats are rodents. They are related to rats and mice. The queen from this zoo was actually quite a young one, because we know from naked mole rat colonies in captivity that they can be 40 years or even older. So we are not entirely sure how old they really can get.
So that's older than the new French Prime Minister, which is my new benchmark for how old things can get.
Yes.
So wait, we don't know how old they can potentially get. So potentially very old.
Yes, and that's not the only interesting thing about that, because besides that they can get very old, they also don't get any age-related diseases as we humans would get. So they don't show any signs of dementia, they don't have cancer, or it's very rare that they develop cancer, so they seem to be healthy until they die.
What a fascinating animal to study. And you have them in your lab, don't you?
Yes, we do, yeah.
Now, they're very strange looking. How would you describe naked mole rats?
I would describe them as they're so ugly that they are cute again. I find them incredibly cute. And it's not so much also the way they look, it's also their behavior. They are hilarious. You know, they look like little sausages that run through tunnels in an incredible fast speed, and they can run forwards and backwards the same speed, and just watching them, is so entertaining.
So your specialism is circadian rhythms, and we have those. We have internal clocks that control sleep, among other things. Why are naked mole rats interesting for that?
Yes, so the reason why naked mole rats are so interesting is because they, in their natural habitat, they live nearly all their life underground and very rarely come out, but most of the time they don't. So we have found now that they have a very, very strong circadian rhythm. And why they are so interesting is because the environmental cue that most organisms use is light. but they live under darkness at very controlled temperature, very controlled humidity. So they don't have really any seasonal changing environmental cue that could synchronize the circadian rhythms, yet they still have a really strong rhythm. So we try to find out why that is and whether that explains why they live so long.
And we as humans pretty much just ignore the light cues that we get. So we live in a sometimes 24-hour society, and particularly our leaders, there's this huge culture of always being on. And thinking back to Gabriel Attal, France's new Prime Minister, who we were talking about earlier, I mean, when you're in charge, you work all the hours, you're always travelling. Some leaders boast that they can get away with very little sleep. Is that really a good idea?
I mean, there are some people who can live with very little sleep, but it is incredibly, incredibly rare. So for most people would need about 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And any disruption of our circadian rhythm, and that disruption could be your politicians going on travel and having loads of jet lags because they're flying backwards and forwards. And that will cause problems with your health.
Okay, so we might think that we're coping, but actually we don't know how much better we could be doing if we ate at the right time and slept at the right time and didn't get on planes.
And there have been so many amazing studies done on how, lack of sleep, whether that's the night before or a few nights before to recall memory, massively affects it. So I always tell my students not to do what I did as a student and sleep the night before and not cram the last information because it doesn't go in anyway.
So what kind of sort of disruptions, what kind of problems can you link to the fact that we ignore our body clocks?
I mean, basically any disease that you can think of, whether that's cancer, whether that's obesity, whether that's dementia, Alzheimer's disease, circadian disruption have been linked to these diseases. And this is very, very simple. And you have mentioned it at the very beginning when you were talking about stress. If our hormones, including our stress hormone cortisol, our sleep hormone melatonin, if they're all nicely rhythmic, over 24 hours, then that allows your body to function at perfect health. But any disruption will cause those hormones to basically go down in a spiral of poor health. And over a long time, if you have that on chronically, that will then start to cause severe diseases like, as I mentioned, cancer, obesity, Alzheimer's disease, and so on.
Zella, maybe I can ask you a question. As a new mom who has a 2-month-old and is not getting much sleep, how do I get affected and how do all the other moms like me get affected?
That is such a good question. So you are a little bit protected by your hormones at the moment. But there are some really, really fascinating studies on when a circadian rhythm develops in newborns, and it takes quite some time. So until that time comes, if the mother has a good rhythm, and even if you have disrupted sleep in the night when your baby wakes up, if you have a good rhythm, you still produce a melatonin, and that will then help your baby sleep a little bit better. But basically what you have to do is wait until the circadian rhythm of your newborn develops itself and until it starts to come in its own rhythm, and then you can have your own rhythm back.
It might never happen.
It took a long time with my children, I have to admit, but it will happen eventually.
Gisela Helfer, thank you so much for coming on Unexpected Elements and sharing your work with us.
You are very welcome. I love talking about naked mole rats, so you did me a massive favor there.
There's a Chinese New Year coming up, and it should be the year of the naked mole rat.
I totally agree with that.
So we've gone from the incredibly youthful new French Prime Minister, and he led us to how stress turns your hair grey. We've talked over the pitfalls of peaking too soon when earmarked for greatness as a child. And maybe we should take tips from the naked mole rat. Keeping your body clock happy might be the secret to ageing well. Still to come on the show, the legacy of China's one-child policy and the worry of being a so-called leftover. We talk multilingual puns and we find out where on Earth, or should that be where off Earth, this planet's water came from.
This is the BBC World Service, bringing major news stories into focus.
Every weekday, we take a close-up look at one big global news story so you can understand what's really going on.
Any kind of misinformation that can be amped up is a threat to lots of simultaneous elections at once.
With expert analysis from BBC journalists around the world.
I've spent quite a bit of time with the Houthis in Yemen, and they're defiant. They go their own way.
Making sense of the news with smart takes and a fresh perspective.
I did notice a difference. Talking to her informally, without cameras around, she was more chatty, more kind of natural, I suppose is the expression I would use.
One global story at a time, in detail, daily.
The new king of Denmark, he's a very nice person, but he has big shoes to fill.
The Global Story at bbcworldservice.com/global story or wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Coming up after the news, the legacy of China's one-child policy and the worry of being a so-called leftover. We talk multilingual puns, time-space synesthesia, or how some people can visualise their calendars mapped out in their minds, and find out where on Earth, or should that be where off Earth, this planet's water came from. That's all in Unexpected Elements, coming up shortly.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. Pakistan has carried out strikes on what it called terrorist hideouts in Iran in the wake of Iranian attacks on Pakistani soil 2 days ago. The Foreign Ministry said a number of people were killed in Sistan-Baluchistan province. The United States military says it's targeted 14 Houthi missiles in Yemen, which were loaded and ready to be launched. The airstrikes came shortly after an American-owned commercial vessel was hit by a drone fired from Houthi-controlled territory on Wednesday. Medicines for Israeli hostages held by Hamas and aid for Palestinians in Gaza has entered the war-ravaged territory from Qatar. It's the first consignment to arrive as part of an agreement between Israel and Hamas. The homes of Uganda's two main opposition politicians have been blockaded by security forces ahead of a planned protest in the capital Kampala. Kizza Besigye and the former pop star Bobi Wine say they're being prevented from leaving. Singapore's Transport Minister S. Iswaran has resigned after appearing in court to face multiple charges. He pleaded not guilty to 27 alleged offences, including obstructing the course of justice. It's the biggest corruption scandal in Singapore in recent times. East African heads of state are meeting at a summit in Uganda to discuss the Sudan war and tension between Ethiopia and Somalia. But Sudan's military-led government has refused to attend after the regional body IGAD invited the head of its rival, the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. Literary critics in Japan have questioned whether an author who won a prestigious award truly deserved it, after she announced that it was partially written using artificial intelligence. Rie Kudan said about 5% of her novel, Sympathy Tower, was generated by the chatbot ChatGPT. BBC News.
This is Unexpected Elements from the BBC World Service, the show that looks at the science behind the news. With me are...
Hi, this is Yang Cheng joining from Austin, Texas this week.
And Candice Bailey joining from Johannesburg, South Africa.
And I'm Marnie Chesterton in Cardiff in the UK. Candice, Yang and I sift through a lot of headlines for science stories, and sometimes one of us finds a regional story that definitely needs a global boost. Yang, you've brought this week's, so what are you talking about?
So this week, actually, the Chinese government is expected to release the official birth figures for last year, 2023. But leaked reports and academic estimations all point to another year of plummeting birth rate and a shrinking population. The estimation is there will be about 7 to 8 million births compared to 11 million deaths last year.
Okay, so around 3 million fewer people.
Yes. So the China's population is estimated to have fallen by a little over 3 million last year, which is about the population of a small Chinese city or a very large American city. So actually, 2022 was the first time in 60 years the Chinese government reported a decline in total population. The last time this happened was during the Great Famine during Mao's Great Leap Forward in the early 1960s. So in 2022, the fertility rate in China also dropped to a record low of 1.09, which means that on average, a Chinese woman only has just over one child, while on average, 2 or more children is needed to maintain a stable population.
Okay, so why is this happening? Do we know?
So, of course, our population changes is a very complicated social issue, and the declining birth rate is not unique to China. For example, we've also seen in other developed economies like Japan, South Korea, and European countries. However, in China, there is a major unique factor, and that is one-child policy that was in the books for over 3 decades. Policy basically mandated that other than ethnic minorities and rural households, most Chinese families, especially urban families, were only allowed to have one child. For example, I myself, I was born in 1989, and I might mention here that I was born the same year as the new French Prime Minister. I'm 7 months younger, so I have 7 months to become the head of a major economy.
Come on, Yang Yang. I'm rooting for you.
Thank you. Not that I have the desire or the ambition. On the other
none of that is relevant. Come on.
Exactly. And as a physicist, I can tell you that all time is relative. But coming back to the issue of demographics in China, so I myself being born in 1989 during the one-child policy, like many daughters born in that era, this is a very personal issue for me. I've also often wondered whether my presence denied my family the son they would have preferred.
Oh, Yang Yang. Is that normal among girls?
I think for a lot of girls born under the one-child policy, it's a very common sentiment because there is indeed a social preference for sons. And so it's something that my peers and we may or may not speak about so explicitly.
And is the one-child policy responsible because there are fewer people or because its legacy discourages people from having children or multiple children?
Yeah, so the one-child policy's impact on China's population is complicated. On one hand, of course, the policy itself, by severely limiting the number of children a family could have, poses a major contributing factor to this currently shrinking Asian population. On the other hand, when you have this policy in the books for over 3 decades, and when children of my generation or slightly older or slightly younger were the only child in their family, society has restructured to support this kind of family structure. So it's become very, very difficult for families to have more than one child now that the Chinese government is actively encouraging young families to have more children.
I think I heard that the one-child policy was invented by rocket scientists. Is that true?
Indeed, in some ways. So this is actually a really, really interesting example of this gendered notion of science. So basically, it was using systems engineering for family planning. And the political and historical background is that for this group of Chinese rocket scientists, they got their start in their careers in the 1950s in the Chinese space and missile programs. They survived the Mao era campaigns. And in the late 1970s and early 80s, they rose in stature and rose into political leadership as this new generation of technocrats in the reform era. And they brought this notion to family planning and population control, where they basically, in their patriarchal imagination, it's actually very, very interesting, right? It's like women's bodies are like rockets that can fire on command, or they can be kept in storage when not needed.
Spoiler, as a biologist, that's not how women's reproductive systems work.
And that's also not how children are born or family planning works, right? That's a very complicated social issue.
So back to this policy, it ended very recently, didn't it?
Yes. So in 2016, the government officially ended this policy and implemented a 2-child policy that has more recently been expanded to a 3-child policy. So what is very interesting is, on one hand, the government is indeed placing a lot of policy incentives and political pressure and social pressure for young couples to have more children to alleviate this demographic crisis. On the other hand, the Chinese government has not yielded population control altogether. It still has different types of control. Right now, it's a 3-child policy on one hand. On the other hand, the government has also placed stricter controls on ethnic minorities like Uyghur and Tibetan women. on queer families and single women in accessing reproductive technologies when they really want to have children. And it's still restricting access to reproductive technologies and restricting childbirth for people with disabilities or certain types of diseases.
Candice, is there anything like that in South Africa?
We don't have a one-child policy in South Africa. There was a time that there was sectors of society were talking about trying to introduce a two-child policy, but that really died down. And what we have is we have a child support grant in South Africa. So if you are a single mom, you can get a support grant if you have a child. So that also obviously influences the number of children people have. A lot of more African people are not having more than 1 to 2 children.
Yeah, I'm presuming that that's a factor here as well. It's kind of, and also that there are women who didn't settle down and have a family at all, right, Yang Yang?
Exactly. So the Chinese government really want, in particular, urban, college-educated, middle-class Han Chinese women to have more children. On the other hand, a lot of these women would prioritize their studies or their careers and are choosing to delay marriage and childbirth. And so the government has actually been pushing on its propaganda efforts to pressure women like myself, or slightly younger, to have more children, especially in the late 2000s. The authorities came up with this notion, 剩女, or leftover women. Basically, it says that if a woman was still single and childless by age 26 or 27, she is left over and unwanted.
Thank you, Yang Yang. And at this point, I just want to quote my old cookery teacher who said, "It takes a very good man to be better than no man." Moving on. On Unexpected Elements, we're constantly asking you, the listener, for your contributions to the show because, boy, do you deliver when you email us. So we're going to read out some of the best. Let's start with listener Helen. Now, in our first episode this year, we talked about a form of synesthesia that has some people seeing events or commitments in their mind. And Helen wrote to us to say, "I'd never heard of time-space synesthesia before, but apparently I have it. It's one of those things that before hearing your program, I thought everybody lived with. Now I'm actually quite baffled as to how anyone else who doesn't have it conceptualizes time. For me, time is a tape measure that I'm sitting on. Each day is a gap between the lines, and stuff far in the past or the future is rolled up. I can unroll it for reference, but it's not readily visible." That is fascinating. And just checking, neither of you, Candice, Yang Yang, have a kind of mental tape measure with all of your diary plans on it, do you?
No, but I think it would help me quite a lot. So maybe,
yeah, definitely.
Is there a way of getting this?
Sadly not. You've either got it like listener Helen, or you don't. Caitlin from the United States had a similar experience, telling us, "This episode of Unexpected Elements is mind-blowing to me. I had no idea there was a name for what I experience with time represented visually in my mind. In my mind, time is presented visually depending on the duration of time. So time by years and centuries appears chronologically as a linear timeline within all years, centuries, and decades demarcated. The timeline scrolls to the left as time passes, with the present moment always the furthest point to the right as a red bar. So the equivalent of my Google Calendar, or something like that, is what one of our listeners just has in their head, and it's even colour coordinated, which I'm particularly envious of. Now, moving on to puns, which is, I know, a fraught topic. People have very strong opinions on puns. Wendy in Australia has noted that we occasionally bust out puns in the show, and this has got her wondering if all languages use puns. And we looked into this, and as far as we can tell, yes. So I'm only the English speaker here. So Candice, Yang Yang, any non-English puns?
Well, in my language, one of the languages in my country, Afrikaans, there are lots of puns, but in order to explain them to you, it would be very difficult. So.
Okay, and you know how Afrikaans is based on Dutch, and so I have a Dutch multilingual joke about breeding horses. Unfortunately, it's entirely too rude for the World Service, so you're just going to have to Google it. Yang Yang?
Oh, I don't know about puns. Things the Chinese language has a lot of homophones, so there are a lot of puns that can be constructed, but not so easy to explain on air.
So there is one that I can say, and it's French. So why don't people order 2 eggs in France?
I don't know, you tell me.
Because in French, 1 egg is a neuf. Enough. Okay, enough of this.
Oh my God. I hope the new French Prime Minister outlaws this terrible pun.
I did warn listeners that puns divide people. Listeners, if you know any multilingual puns, then please do share with the group. unexpected@bbc.co.uk is the email address. You can send us a voice note. I'd love it if you voiced up your own pun for us. The WhatsApp number for that is +44 330 678 3080, or send us a postcard. Unexpected Elements, BBC World Service, Cardiff, UK, CF10 4GA. Still to come on the show, where did all this planet's oceans come from? That's coming up after this.
Hello, Quizman Dan here, back to give you the answer to our weekly Unexpected Elements quiz question. Earlier, we asked you about a physics paper published in 1975 and co-authored by Jack H. Hetherington and F.D.C. Willard. We wanted to know what was unusual about F.D.C. Willard. A, that he died more than 100 years previously. B, that he was a cleaner who'd accidentally solved a problem on Jack Hetherington's blackboard. Or C, that he was a cat. Well, we can reveal the correct answer is C. After writing his paper alone, Jack Hetherington realised he'd written it all in the plural we, so instead of going back and editing it all into the singular, he decided to instead add a second author, F.D.C. Willard, otherwise known as his cat Chester. Very well done if you got that one. Now let's head back to the programme.
As well as receiving your brilliant correspondence on synesthesia, puns, bananas, any of the other weird and wonderful things that have caught your attention, we also love opening our mailbox to find these scientific mysteries that you want answers to. So, with that in mind, it's time for Ask the Unexpected. This week we've had a question from Barbara, one of our listeners in the UK, in somewhere called St Leonards-on-Sea, who may be inspired by her seaside location, has asked, where did all the water on our planet come from? Well, we've enlisted the help of a scientist who's looking into exactly that.
Hi Barbara, I'm Megan Newcomb and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in the United States in their Department of Geology. This is a surprisingly complex question that's being actively debated by a lot of scientists right now, including myself. So I'm going to take you back to the first millions of years of the solar system formation. So we have a young sun surrounded by gas and dust that is very hydrogen rich, and that is what accreted to form all of the planets. And so potential water sources in this environment include the hydrogen-rich gas itself, because hydrogen can react with oxygen in minerals to form water. Also, dust from the nebula can contain water in the form of ice crystals and organic molecules, and we form icy-rich comets in the outer solar system. So the dust accretes into small pebble-sized objects and then into larger kilometer-scale planetesimals, which is a fancy word for baby planets. And those baby planets collide together to form the planets. And so the water content of the planetesimals depends on how far away from the sun they were when they formed. It's warmer in the inner solar system and cooler in the outer solar system. And at some point along that gradient is the point where water is stable as ice instead of water vapor. And so if you form a planetesimal far from the sun, you're more likely to form a water-rich material. And then another factor that's really important is the amount of thermal processing these solid objects have experienced. So early in the solar system, there's a lot of radioactive decay, and that heats up the solids that are accreting. And in heating them up to their melting point, you actually very easily boil off the water. And so something that I've been working on recently is looking at samples of planetesimals that underwent melting, and we found that they were extremely dry, and they actually contained just a couple of parts per million of water, regardless of whether they formed in the warm inner solar system or the cold outer solar system. And therefore, any kind of melted material couldn't have delivered water to Earth. So Earth got its water by accreting unmelted objects. And potential candidates would be objects that accreted after all the radioactive decay had occurred, so that they didn't undergo melting, and objects that accreted far enough from the sun that there was ice crystals present as they were forming.
So thank you very much to Megan Newcomb. And just to clarify, because Megan says accretion a lot, she just means clumping together. So a lot of the water in our solar system clumped together far enough away from the sun that it didn't melt, and then it smashed into our Earth, which is just at the right place, the sort of Goldilocks zone where it can sit in liquid form on our planet. I should say that scientists do still argue about this, and there are lots of different theories out there. But thank you very much, Megan Newcomb, for explaining it to us, giving us an overview, and good luck with your research. And thank you, Barbara, for sending in your question. If you're like Barbara and you've got a scientific question you'd like us to solve, then please do send it our way and we'll get on the case. You can email us on unexpected@bbc.co.uk, or our WhatsApp number is +44 330 678 3080. Now, we've spent a lot of this episode looking at scientific quirks of aging and leadership, and so much of aging has negative connotations, but I wanted to find a couple of positive steps that we could all take associated with a long and healthy life. And so I looked into the World Service back catalogue, and boy, it delivers in spades. So, a couple of kind of good cheery points. First up is the BBC Food Show, The Food Chain, which I recommend you all listen to. It recently looked into whether you could eat your way to 100. So they spoke to Professor Sarah Harper from Oxford University. She studies aging, and here's her recipe for a healthy life.
I think we're beginning to understand that diet is incredibly important. In fact, we, at the population level, we really do understand now what leads to a healthy population. And that basically means that you want to live in a community where you have low levels of social isolation, low levels of loneliness. You want to have an active life, both physical and mental. In other words, you are still making a contribution well into later life. And you are doing a lot of exercise, not necessarily running marathons, but you are just generally keeping your exercise up. You have purpose in your life. And then we know that that has to really be supported by a healthy diet, and a healthy diet across the life course as well.
Now, Yang, Candice, bringing you in here because I think we've all got a rough idea of what makes a healthy diet for a long, healthy life. So before we hear some of the details, take a guess, both of you. I want one group of age-friendly foods from each of you. Candice?
So, interesting one. Just today I was Googling this and I found that eating pears, helps you to age well. My vote's with pear.
Okay, your vote's for pear. Yang, anything?
This is actually really interesting because there is a notion in traditional Chinese medicine that eating pears would help clear your lungs, so it's good for your pulmonary system. But I would go with fish.
Okay, so we've got pears and fish from the same Food Chain episode. Here's some answers from Dan Bootner. Now, he's an expert on something called blue zones. Have you come across these?
No, not.
No? They're parts of the world where lots of people live to be 100 or more. And he's analysed the diets in these parts of the world, and he's found remarkable similarities. Take a listen.
The 5 types of foods that emerge very clearly in all 5 cultures over time are whole grains. It's wheat in the Mediterranean areas. It's rice in Asia. It's corn in Costa Rica. Greens of all sorts, probably 80 to 90 different variety of greens. Nuts, tubers like sweet potatoes and regular potatoes, and beans. Did they eat meat? Yes. But on average, it was fewer than 5 times a month. Meat was a celebratory food. You ate it after church or on a lunar holiday or a wedding, or it wasn't a daily. Of course, there wasn't much in the way of processed food. Sugar was expensive and hard to get. They probably consumed a quarter of the amount of sugar we eat today. So they're eating mostly a whole food, plant-based diet. It's so clear. You don't even see an outlier. You don't even see a place where, they're eating 50% meat. So I published that work, and it's held up over time.
So I guess pears might count. I don't know. They might be too sugary. And actually,
well, I put pears in the greens.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure that's what he means by greens. And
it's really unripe pear.
Exactly, yes. You can have an unripe pear. And he said, interestingly enough, although a lot of these communities are coastal, they're just inland from coast. So fish isn't actually a kind of regular, it's a kind of weekly part of the diet rather than a kind of daily part of the diet. But what he said was stuff that I feel like I've heard 1,000 times before. I feel like we've all come across these steps saying, hey, eat your greens, eat whole grains. And I said I'd give you a couple of positive steps to a healthy old age. And if you don't fancy eating more whole grains and cutting out the sugar and the meat and the dairy, how about this one? Fall in love. Yes? Yeah, wow. I know. So the conversation is a World Service discussion show with 2 female guests, and Chilean novelist Isabel Allende was on it back in 2019, talking about the beauty of aging, and asked what kept her so young. She talked about falling in love in her 70s.
Well, let's talk about that, Isabel, your approach to the aging process. So you like to look the best you can. What else do you do?
For aging, I keep my brain active. I think that's the most important, to be curious, alert, engaged, to have purpose in my life, to be in love. That has helped me a lot. People lately have been saying that I look 20 years younger, but that's because I'm in love. I don't know how long that will last, but I'm enjoying it.
Well, tell us about that love that's keeping you radiant and happy.
Well, life is full of surprises. One day a guy heard me on NPR in New York on the radio and started emailing me every morning and every night for 5 months until we finally met. And he immediately proposed marriage, which I'm not willing to do. Why would anybody get married at any age? Oh my God, it's horrible. And then he moved into my house. So now we're a little crowded in that small place. But we've been living together for 14 months. And I have never been happier in a relationship, ever. So people ask me, journalists mostly, ask me, how is it to fall in love at 76? It's the same as falling in love at 20, but with a sense of urgency. How many more years do we have? Maybe 5, maybe 10 if we are very lucky. We have no time for pettiness and for little things.
Novelist Isabel Allende there. I just love that. We have no time for pettiness. Isn't that great, gang?
So sweet.
That is so beautiful. I think this is like a really, really strong counter-argument to this whole leftover women nonsense. And it's also an idea to know that instead of having like a fixed schedule or there is an optimal time for something, whether it's getting smart or falling in love, be open to possibilities. Don't stress and go gray.
Yeah.
That sums it up really well. Yang Yang.
So that's us come towards the end of another episode. So I've learned that if stress has turned your hair grey, if you've been put in charge of running a country, for example, that might be reversible if you de-stress whilst still young enough. And that although I'm technically a leftover in Chinese culture, that I'm also old and wise enough not to mind that much, although falling in love late in life might be the secret to aging well.